subject, the future of Atlantic relation. What an issue for this debate. We could spend the entire night together. I don't want to occupy your plan for the evening, so we'll start with a question for each of you. And I guess 8 minutes could be sufficient for the first round of question and answers. The second round will be shorter, and I guess that in 1 hour, around 8 p.m., we could say each other bye-bye. The future of Atlantic relation. Nowadays, these days, it's the big interest of everyone, from the prime ministers of Europe to the ministers, because there is a big curiosity about the new administration and what will be the future of the relation. If Joe Biden is very well known to be a friend of Europe and a good connoisseur of the European relation, on the other side, we really don't know what the new administration will think and will do, and how much the impact of this particular moment will be in the relation. I would like to introduce for my first question Giuliano Amato, who is a very well known among us and among the audience. Should I call you Professor Amato, President Amato, whatever, but you are so well known that you don't need an introduction. My question is, we are so relaxed about the new-old relation between the United States and Europe with the new administration. But is that true that our relation will go back to the previous friendship, or something is changed in these years after the Trump era?
Well, thank you, Maria. My personal view, I might be wrong, is that the risk is more on the European side nowadays than on the American side after Biden, assuming that Biden is going to be the president. I expect the US, of course, not to go back, because there is no back in history. There is always something forward that is different from what we had before, but certainly he has already announced it. Some of the ruptures introduced by Trump will be healed, and it will be perhaps easier outside than inside after listening to the previous panel. Healing means going back to the Paris Agreement, for instance. Healing means returning into the World Trade Organization, allowing it to work, the Health Organization, etc. There is a propensity of the future new administration to restore the texture of the multilateral organization of the world that Trump had by purpose broken down piece by piece. The fact of the matter is that on the one side, the pandemic, on the other side, Trump himself, China, and the new context of international organizations have created a new atmosphere in our international relations, due to which, and now I concentrate for a moment on Europe, Europe itself was always been the advocate of multilateral negotiation to solve international disputes, etc., of international organizations, of global free trade regulated only by the rules of competition, etc., is somehow changing some of the basic pillars of its previous vision of the world. There is something that has been touching for all of us, more the pandemic perhaps than Trump, when we realized that due to the ordinary division of labor among the countries of the world in producing goods and services, it could happen that you all of a sudden need masks to fight the virus. You don't have them, and you cannot receive the necessary supply from the countries you were used to work with because of the virus itself, because of the lockdown that has involved also international trade relations. Due to this new perception of the world production, the idea that we have to be self-sufficient about some of the products we need, the idea that it has not to be entirely free in the world, but there is something we need from ourselves, something else, etc. Some sovereign interferences with the market are unavoidable. This new sensation of a different world has produced here in Europe very new and, in my view, also dangerous, taken to the last consequences, ideas, such as a sort of, golden power, limiting foreign investments, having the state behind the companies that produce something that is important, a sort of neo-mercantilism of the 21st century. And a sort of return to a Westphalian order or disorder in which the states as such play a fundamental role also in the economy. Now, if this is true, the demand is, what about the transatlantic relations? What about the fundamental agreements we had before with the ally on the other side of the ocean? What about a future in which like-minded countries and like-minded in defending democracy are an essential part of whatever conflict or whatever negotiation we might have in the world? We see, and everybody has been impressed in this day, the regional comprehensive economic partnership taking shape in the eastern part of the world and dominated by China. What are we going to do? Will we try to join that partnership, or will we think that something else is needed, restoring the sense of the transatlantic relationship? I'm finishing my minutes, and I simply quote the last editorial accompanied by a detailed briefing of The Economist that suggests a sort of grand bargain between the US, Europe, and possibly also the Asian countries that are like-minded in terms of democracy. This is the way we should face the future. What are we going to do? Are we on our own as Europeans stand before this very difficult world? The young man who is running France with great ideas, good ideas, European feelings that I appreciate, has defined the transatlantic alliance a nonsense. Now, I deeply disagree with this kind of view. I tend to agree with the grand bargain that putting together, it's pointless for us to fight against China by using prohibition. The G5, Huawei, these sort of things can be fought with the technological and economic alliance between us and the states, and we can produce the same things better. We know that it can be done. In Europe, we already have the technologies. We have to develop them more. And therefore, as the Economist rightly says, a sort of digital trade zone made up with the two sides of the Atlantic, mostly based on cybersecurity, privacy protection, which is protected in China as long as it is between private companies. But if the government wants data and information, everybody is legally obliged to provide the government with the information it wants. And third, democratic values that needs somebody that defends them for the future. We already have Western scholars proposing the Chinese model for the world. Do we agree with him? Do we want the nice lady that took the floor in the previous during the previous panel to be right in thinking that a social democrat and a communist more or less are the same thing?
Thank you, President Amato. Oh, being in the board of Center for American Studies, and you perfectly know how important our relation between Europe and the United States for our Center for American Studies. I trust the idea of a new refreshing era of very good relation between the two continents. And I hope that nevertheless, what President Macron is saying in the latest interview, well, the interest for Europe and for the continent will be to share with the United States exactly what you have said. I mean, project in common to compete on the same level with other important powers. And it's the same thing that talking with a friend of mine that everybody, I guess, is well known, David Axelrod, the previous counselor for President Obama. This is the idea that many Democrats are still thinking about. But I'm curious to know if Professor Craig Calhoun, who is joining us, think that this will be the path. I mean, United States and Europe with a common front to compete on technology and not also on technology with China. Is this the path, Professor Calhoun?
Well, thank you, Maria. And let me thank also President Amato with his comments. I agree. But I don't think that the path will be a common block to develop technology for competition with China. First, that is simply not how competition works in the current global economy. And second, it's not how the development of new technology works. And so I think that there may be lots of European-American cooperation, but that particular path isn't exactly the right conception. There are also complications in front of that path and any other. So we've started by thinking about the response to the disruption of Atlantic relations under Donald Trump. We need to restore trust, of course. I want to just signal that this remains a challenge for reasons discussed in the first session. And what the US, what President Biden can deliver is a different question from what the Biden administration may want. I think that the description friend of Europe is a tricky description for any American president right now. But there is a reason to want this friendship because European-American cooperation is needed to renew or reform global institutions, much more than simply to join in competition with China. I think the task of European-American cooperation is to do things like renew and rebuild the World Health Organization and other key international institutions in finance and in all sorts of arenas. The institutions were largely created by European-American cooperation in the wake of World War II, and they have fallen into difficulties. Europe and America have a special role in renewing them, though Europe and America will have to give up their control of them. They will have to give up the friendly partnership that says, oh, we'll have one European to head this agency, one American to have that agency, and forget completely about other parts of the world. Being a friend of Europe means something different, I think, because Europe has changed. And President Amato alluded to some of this. But note that these last years have included Brexit. They have included a new kind of North-South divide, really already on the table since the financial crisis of a decade ago. They include conflicts and quite severe differences of views between some of the old and new members of the EU, with the very different politics of Hungary and Poland, for example. And they include the reemergence of the image of core Europe, of the major founding countries and everybody else, and what this means in Europe. Europe has also changed, I think, because it pursued greater integration in a way that put free flows of capital ahead of building solidarity. And that's become an issue. But let me just say Europe has changed. Second, though, the US and Europe have a different situation in the world. This has already been alluded to in regard to China, but I think in regard to the reemergence of a kind of great power politics, which we see in several ways in the world and which fits with the ambitions of Putin's Russia, but which also figures in other settings. And the conflicts between India and China are not reducible to byproducts of North Atlantic conflicts. There is a new set of emerging conflicts in the world. And I think there is a shifting hegemony in what Emanuel Wallerstein called the modern world system. I think we had for a very long time a European and then American hegemony in this modern world system and ability to anchor it and secure some rules for its operations. But that is shifting and breaking down. We don't yet know exactly what will happen. People talk about a new Chinese hegemony. I'm not convinced of that. I think, however, we are living through a period of upset in that. We should remember the previous period of upset was the 30 years that included World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. We are living through another kind of upset in this. In this context, capitalism has changed. The economy is neither that of the post-war era, when with vaguely Keynesian ideas, Europe and the US built the international institutional framework, the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth. nor is it that of neoliberalism and its attacks on such institutions and on the welfare state. 50 years of neoliberalism is coming to an end too. It has unraveled in various ways. If it got its start in the 73, 74 crisis and became a big factor, obviously it had an older intellectual history, it's running into its own crises in the current context. And we aren't sure what the new will mean beyond that. Capitalism changed, however, during this 50 years, not just because there were neoliberals, but because there was a dramatic increase in the role of finance. And this remains true. We live in a very financialized world, and we haven't come to terms fully with that, and it changes the meaning of the North Atlantic relations. We live in a world of corporations. We can't understand this entirely in terms of international relations if we don't understand the role of Google and Alibaba and Apple and these other giant corporations, which are players in this international arena alongside nations, but not reducible to nations. You can't just say, oh, Google, it's American, and fully understand the issues. Corporate power is something that's basic to contemporary capitalism. Nation states and the European Union can be a friction to limit corporate power. They can provide courts to try to ensure fair practices of various kinds. But corporate power is a reality that has to be accepted. The technological transformations are also a factor changing capitalism. We are entering an era of transformed work, transformed opportunities for people to earn livings. And this will be very basic to politics in both Europe and the United States, and more generally. Finally, for this 8-minute review, there are big new issues on the table. The pandemic is an obvious one, but so is climate change. Migration is a big issue. We have to remember 2015 and the crises in Europe over migration and the continuing issues of migration and the potential for new migrations with climate change. There is an evident reorganization of a very far right. I don't mean just the Republican Party of the US, but overlapping that, the QAnon conspiracy, the neo-Nazi movements, white supremacists, on a large scale transnationally. This is an issue Europe and the US have to figure out how to deal with. Last for this list, tax evasion and illicit trade. Capitalism doesn't work just by the rules, including the rules that Europe and America have tried to set. It works in the interstices of these rules. It works in outright defiance of them. Something like a quarter or a third of all global trade is illicit, at least in part. It is off the books and not paying taxes in some places, and thus depriving governments of the ability to carry out their policies. And it includes trafficking in weapons, drugs, people, money, that is outside the control of straightforward international relations. So we could, Europe and the United States, work to try to renew our capacity to bring this illicit capitalism into greater compliance with the legal norms that we champion. But it would take a significant project, and it would meet significant resistance.
Oh, thank you, Professor Calhoun. It was extremely fascinating and also a little bit frightening, the scenario you have painted for us. And I would like to pick up from the very interesting scenario you painted for us a few pills and ask to my colleagues, Rampini, who is joining us, if he shared the idea that the change that is obviously currently in the idea of capitalism could have an effect, could impact on the transatlantic relation. And if Europe traditionally follow what happened in the United States, is the change of capitalism having already an effect on our European capitalism, or our countries are far from realizing that something important is changing in the economy of our two different continents?
Thank you, Maria. Well, on this very specific question you're asking me, I'm afraid that the divide between the United States and Europe has grown even larger, wider, because since the start of the pandemic and especially since the beginning of the massive lockdowns experiments, the main winners are located here in the United States. In fact, I'm speaking to you right now from the Silicon Valley, California, where they've never been happier. I mean, of course, the shareholders, and also a large part of the workforce working for the behemoths of the digital economy. Some of them are located nearby where I'm right now, like Google. Others are further north, like Amazon or Microsoft. But they're the winners by far. You look at their stock market capitalization. They've really won. It's like they had prepared for this calamity 20 years ago. They started planning for a lockdown economy. So there's a part of the US economy which is almost triumphant. And Europe is lagging as usual. There's no real champion, digital champion in Europe, not a European one, nor a national one in Germany or in France or in Italy or in England that you could compare to any of these, like Apple or Amazon. So I don't really see any convergence between the two models, even less so between the economic values, the economic culture shared by European populations and the Americans. You know, one thing which was almost unnoticed in the last elections here in the United States, because of course we were all of us were looking at the White House as the main prize, but there were referenda, interesting referendum, most of them here in California. And Proposition 22 was a referendum which could have ended the experiment of a gig economy by Uber, Lyft, and others. And it didn't happen. Although California is presumed to be the most liberal, the most progressive, even the most radical leftist state in the US, it's still a very much a capitalist state where a majority of the voters preferred to leave Uber and Lyft and Instacart and others, free to pursue their profit-making business without having the responsibility to treat their workers as full-time workers with all the rights and the entitlements and healthcare, etc. So basically, it was a vote for Proposition 22 in favor of capitalism. And you have other examples. There was another referendum here in California that could have allowed massive increase in real estate property taxation, and that referendum failed. So at the same time, when the California voters were voting massively with huge majorities for Joe Biden, they also voted in favor of capitalism and pretty much a free, totally free capitalism. which doesn't happen in any European country nowadays. So I see the divide growing even wider. But I would like also to add a few comments, very brief comments on what Giuliano Amato said, because I basically agree with him. And you know, I think we are lucky that as we are speaking, Joe Biden just announced most of his choices for his foreign policy staff. So some of the first comments were, this is Obama 3. In fact, I think this is really Biden 1, because Joe Biden is an old hand at foreign policy, and most of the people he selected are long-time counselors for him. But I also think that expectations are so high in Europe about the benefits of a Joe Biden presidency that there will be disappointments. It's inevitable that there will be disappointments and disillusions. I agree with Giuliano Amato that there are more unknowns on the European side. I also agree that a major challenge for Joe Biden, while he's not even a president, he's only an elected president, has been the new free trade agreement reached by Asia, 15 countries of the Asia Pacific, which represents 1/3 of the global GDP and 1/3 of the world population. So I think that Biden will inevitably have to go back to the Asia pivot, which means that the Europeans are not that important to him, except as they can increase his leverage towards China and Russia and Iran. So he will be very polite and very gentle, very courteous with you Europeans. You will feel that you have his full attention, but in fact he will mostly try to engage, to enroll you in a coalition aimed at increasing the US leverage towards China. And here is where the European divisions will become more apparent and more damaging. And especially, I mean, Germany. What does Germany want to do with Russia, with the Nord Stream pipeline? What does Germany want to do with its huge, still huge, trade surplus towards China? Germany has enjoyed a fantastic trade relationship with China, even as they were suffering some of the same problem, intellectual property theft, of course, but still, Germany reaped huge benefits from its trade relation to China. So this is where I think all of a sudden we will pay more attention to the divisions inside Europe, because Biden will need a united Europe in order to increase the US leverage towards China.
Oh, thank you to Federico Rampini. And if I can add a personal, totally personal opinion, I think that Joe Biden toward China will try to save the American consumers, maybe choosing a different field of battle in respect to those fields that President Trump has used before. So maybe this is a totally personal opinion, Germany will find a way to establish a role between the two big powers, United States and China, in a different condition, respect the very difficult relation Angela Merkel had with Trump, but we'll see. This is just a speculation. Torrey Taussig, we can't talk of a future of Atlantic relation if we don't consider what is in the history of this relation, the importance of the American soft power, something that nobody in the history was able to compete with. So my question is, okay, as Federico Rampini said, maybe Europe will be not on the top of the relevance for the Biden administration. But I'm curious to understand, in your opinion, Torrey, where the new American soft power will address the power. It's important, even for the relation of everything from politics to capitalism. I have an idea, and I want to share with you. Will the new American soft power will be supported by the role of a woman like Kamala Harris?
Thank you, Maria. And I just want to start by saying I think this is a very important conversation to be having on November 23rd. You know, we are less than 2 months away from Inauguration Day. And to start off with perhaps what sounds like it's a controversial point for this conversation, I actually think that we are going to see the transatlantic relationship as the centerpiece of US foreign policy in the Biden administration, which goes somewhat against what we've heard our other panelists say, that this will be kind of a renewed pivot to Asia, that Europe may not be front and center. What I would like to start off by saying is that I think we have, first and foremost, a committed transatlanticist in the White House now. And we also have, you know, news coming out yesterday and today with the likely nomination of Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor. We're going to have a team of, and also John Kerry as Special Envoy for Climate Change. We're going to have a cast of characters who Europe knows very well, but who also have in their foreign policy worldviews, visions, Europe at the center, the transatlantic relationship as the centerpiece of renewing American alliances in the world. I think that's another way of talking about American soft power, Maria, is American re-engagement in its kind of traditional alliances for taking on new, emerging, and also long-time challenges in the world. I mean, we've heard President Amato, Professor Calhoun, Federico Rampini talk about these new challenges, whether they be, I guess they're not necessarily all new, but illicit finance, climate change, reinvesting in our multilateral institutions, such as the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. What I see for all of these challenges is the transatlantic relationship being at the centerpiece for addressing all of these issues. Also the challenge from China. I mean, this is an issue where we are going to have bipartisan cooperation, bipartisan support across Congress and now in the White House for taking on this issue. And we're also seeing across the Atlantic, I think for the first time, kind of the most support for looking at the China challenge together, the most convergence on the assessment of the challenges and in some instances, the opportunities posed by Beijing for looking at this issue together. So I wanted to start by saying whether we look at this as soft power, as reinvesting in American alliances, as taking on new challenges to democracy, the China challenge, that the transatlantic relationship will be at the center for addressing all of those issues. That being said, I think, you know, as has been illustrated through the other comments from our panelists, this transatlantic relationship is in crisis. I don't think that we can overstate the loss of shared values, shared trust, shared assessments of the challenges we face more than any time in recent history. Some would say since World War II, we've not seen this type of loss in shared values, trust, cohesion, and soft power, Maria, as you brought up. And so this moment of a Biden administration presents not just an opportunity for rebuilding time and rebuilding trust, but needs to be a time for reinvention, for reimagining this relationship, for taking on the challenges that we are presented with today. But with that very big kind of opening gambit that I've presented, I now want to be very specific in the type of policy coordination we will need between the US and Europe as a way of reinventing, reimagining this relationship. I don't want to go on too long because I think it's important to get to questions, and I think a lot's been mentioned by our previous panelists, but I will say in terms of policy coordination, I see 4 primary areas for cooperation that need to be capitalized on early, and that I think we have the political capital in Washington to capitalize on early. The first is, of course, on the pandemic. We have seen very little transatlantic cooperation to date, very little transnational cooperation with the United States in mind in dealing with the pandemic. I think that's going to change on day one. And I do think that while the focus will be domestic for all of our countries, President Amato and others have mentioned that there is a transnational need for looking at this pandemic, whether that be in the G7 and G20 context, looking at new debt crises that could come out of this pandemic, and also focusing on aid to developing and emerging economies. I think that we're going to see reinvested US support for transnational cooperation at the G7, G20 level. I also think now that we have an administration that's more interested in working through the WTO, through the WHO, that we could see more financial and logistical support for vaccine distribution from the United States, again, through the World Health Organization, but also through COVAX, this global alliance for ensuring equitable access to the vaccine. So that's one. I think that's one very real concrete policy area where we will have renewed transatlantic cooperation. The second existential crisis of our time is on climate change. Again, has been mentioned, but here is another area where we have a lot of opportunity for cooperation. President-elect Biden has stated time and time again that the United States will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords on day one. But that is, of course, only step one to renewing transatlantic cooperation on climate. I see a lot of potential avenues for cooperation here. First and foremost, in the fact that we have now a president-elect and a European Union that have the shared goal of being climate carbon neutral by 2050. I think that opens up a lot of room for at least shared dialogue. Another announcement that was made in the last day or so has been that John Kerry will be a special envoy for climate. I think that's very promising. I think the devil will be in the details of how we are able to cooperate on this issue as the European Union move forward with very concrete policy proposals like the carbon border adjustment. How are we going to work on that together? Will this be compliant with the WTO? Again, devil is in the details, but these are issues that we're going to have to deal with on day one that I see a lot of opportunity for. The third issue, which has been mentioned many times, which I think I'm a little bit more optimistic on than the other panelists, is on China. As I mentioned, I see more convergence in our assessment of the challenges presented by Beijing than we have seen in recent years. Primarily, that has been at the European Union level than at the individual member state level within Europe. But again, we have an administration and a Congress now that is willing to take on this China challenge with our transatlantic allies, as opposed to the Trump administration very unilateral approach. And so I think we're going to see very clear, very early interest from a Biden administration working with Europeans on this issue. However, as our previous panelists have mentioned, this is where divisions within Europe, I think, are going to create more issues than not going forward. And so it will be up to Europe to see whether it can unite on the China challenge. I think that's kind of the first hurdle that transatlantic cooperation will need to overcome. And the final point I'll make, final area for cooperation, I think an early priority we'll see from Washington will be on technology issues. As Federico Rampini mentioned, this is, where we're going to have to overcome a lot of differences. Digital taxation is going to be a huge issue in President-elect Biden's inbox on day one of a new administration. But again, I think when you have this kind of looming challenge of an authoritarian alternative, of an authoritarian Beijing consensus on technology, there is going to be renewed interest in pooling research and development, in creating viable Western democratic competitors in 5G and in other emerging technologies, whether that be just in the transatlantic context or in the broader US, European, Asian context. I think we have room for maneuver on technology as well. So I'll leave it at that. These are the four issue areas I see for cooperation. At least there'll be priorities going out. Actually, the final point I'll make is on trade. I don't see, I think on either side of the Atlantic, a huge push for the type of free trade agreement negotiations that we saw in TTIP. It seems like there'd be a lot of stumbling blocks to enhancing progress on this in the first year of a Biden administration. So I leave that out of my four priority areas for cooperation. But again, something that we're going to have to work very hard on to ensure that disagreements in the area of trade do not become inhibitors to enhancing the type of trust and cohesion and cooperation that is desperately needed at that time, that I think we can make a lot of progress on in the first year of a Biden administration.
Thank you, Torrey Taussig. In your words, I can read a bright side, and I liked it. And also the message is that, well, the ball is also in your field, European. It's up to you, European, to get it or not. So if you all agree, there are a lot of questions because many listeners are joining us, and I will address one of the questions to Professor Amato because it's specifically for him. So Professor Amato, the question from Bruce Lima is, during your speech, you did not mention Russia's influence in Europe. Do you think this threat might reapproximate Europe with the US in the near future?
This is one of the areas where the real issue is whether the European Union and its members have a policy or not. And it's not the only one, because this is where I see a significant difference between us and the States, and the need of a better Europe to create the conditions for the relationship. Let me remember something that somebody says today, that the retreat of the US from several parts of the world and from the role the US had in the world predates Trump. Already with Obama, we had a retreat. Careful. It was not the same thing. I still remember quite well what Obama used to say, and basically his famous speech of El Cairo, when he said, don't rely on us necessarily for every issue in every single part of the world, but not because I don't care, because it's not my only responsibility, because there is a multilateral network of which I am a part of, because you have your own responsibilities and you should take care of issues that are not necessarily depending on me, on my decision, on my soldiers, on my money. So it's not the US abandoning the world. The idea was the US relying on others on the basis of an agreement with these others, on a basic agreement with these others, for a well-ordered world. Now, what has been missing here? The role of Europe. But of course, Russia has a role. Take the Armenian and Azerbaijan issue on the Nagorno-Karabakh problem. Why only Russia played a role, and perhaps also Erdogan, Turkey? Because we, the European Union, did not exist. Libya is even closer. And in Libya, we do not exist. And Obama had Libya in mind at the time. So that's why it's one of the reasons why I see a problem in Europe. Because in order for us to be an acceptable ally of a post-Obama and not against Obama US, we need to catch up with the role that on the other side they might expect us to take. Not necessarily spending some more money in defense, which is necessary, which was not only a Trump issue, it has always been an American issue, but taking our own responsibilities in our region, and therefore having a political role and not only a commercial role with Russia, with the Syrian players, etc. So, in other words, if we want to play our role, we have to decide sooner or later to have a common foreign policy. I well know that is a very difficult issue, an extremely difficult issue, that even now is something between the Commission, the Council, the High Representative, the President of the Commission, the President of the Council. But if we don't solve this problem in a reasonable time, let me make some rhetoric on the transatlantic relation, but the risk is that it remains a rhetoric only.
Thank you. Well, I guess that we need maybe a few minutes more to go deep in this last comment coming from Professor Amato. And because there are a few questions more, one is addressed to Dr. Taussig, and I will go to her, and then maybe Professor Calhoun of Federico Rampini can join for the last few minutes of this debate. So Dr. Taussig, the question is, do you think that the US-EU partnership will be essential to the right populist movement in Europe and around the world, like Brazil? I mean, there will be an impact, a change of the successful last few years this movement had even in South America and Europe.
Yeah, so one of the primary tenets of Biden foreign policy, as has been illustrated in many articles that the president-elect has authored and also in some of the primary speeches that he has made throughout the campaign, is the focus on strengthening democracy at home and abroad. Of course, dealing with the democratic deficits that we have within our own country and within the transatlantic community are going to be first and foremost. There have also been ideas put forward such as hosting a summit, a concert of democracies within the first year of a Biden administration. And so I think you are going to see a renewed push for, again, strengthening democracies at home and abroad. coming from the Biden administration. I think before we get to questions about dealing with right-wing populism in places like Brazil, there is going to be an emphasis on dealing with them within transatlantic, Euro-Atlantic alliances. For some of these challenges, I think they are going to be up for the European Union to decide and to work on. For example, how to deal with declining rule of law, civil society in EU member states like Poland and Hungary, how structural funds will be made conditional or not on upholding rule of law standards in countries like this. But there's also the NATO context. And, you know, I could see a renewed push to hold NATO member states accountable to Article 2 of the founding treaty, to maintain free institutions within our member states, and more pushback on member states that are not willing or able to do so, such as Poland, Hungary, or Turkey, which has been kind of undergoing an authoritarian resurgence under President Erdogan. So before we get to dealing with these right-wing populist issues around the world, I do think we are going to need to have a renewed push to strengthen them within Euro-Atlantic alliances within the United States. I don't think we can ignore the challenges and deficits we've had here within the European Union and also within NATO.
Just to go to an end, there is the last question, and I will address it to Professor Calhoun or Federico Rampini, who want to give an answer to this question. Do you think to study the features of all the rurals who voted for Trump to understand if the technological revolution for the environment is a critical issue for them? So who want to give an answer to this question?
This is one of the most misunderstood definitions when heard by a European audience. Rural does not mean agricultural, which is the meaning in most European countries. So these are simply people who do not live in large metropolitan areas, but neither in suburbs. So it's more of a geographical, sociological, and social values description. Yes, some of these people may have voted for Donald Trump because their jobs are linked to fossil fuels. That happened before in 2016. And when you think of jobs linked to fossil fuels, it's not just people who work in coal mines or in the oil industry. It's also automotive workers at traditional Ford, GM, Chrysler plants in Michigan or in Ohio, who think that their own business might be threatened by a reckless or too quick transition to a green economy. So yes, that's a problem. But I see it as part of a larger problem that the accurate analysis of the vote in the United States have demonstrated that basically Joe Biden was very successful in retaking control of a few upper Midwest states, plus Arizona, but he did not do that by really retaking control of the blue-collar workers. A majority of blue-collar workers still voted for Trump. So the Republican Party, well, let's say the Democratic Party has relinquished to the Republican Party the representation of a large part of the US workers. And that means that we will have to deal, I don't see that the urgency of dealing with Bolsonaro. It's much more important for the near future to understand how we will deal with Donald Trump, because there's already a Donald Trump 2 in the making. I mean, he has signaled by refusing to concede that he will be the leader of a very wild opposition. The Senate will probably remain in Republican hands, which means that in all the issues, many of the issues, except foreign policy, many of the issues that we've tackled, including digital taxation, including free trade, I mean, large free trade agreements, which I also considered very, very unlikely, as Taussig said. On all these matters, Biden will have to compromise with the Republican-led Senate, and behind the Republican-led Senate, there will be the huge shadow of Donald Trump.
Thank you.